Hello and welcome to our live Q&A for the Wargames podcast. And I have to say there's never been a more important time to do this, given what is happening with Iran, with Israel and the US. And also we've heard the security review as well, warning that the UK should be preparing for an attack on the homeland. So an awful lot of things to discuss. We've got loads of questions coming in as well. Want to introduce first the brains behind the podcast, Deborah Haynes, our security and defence editor, who's at the NATO summit today, quite fittingly. And also Dr. Rob Johnson, who's director of the Oxford Strategy, Statecraft and Technology Centre at the University of Oxford. So anyone watching, I should say, can scan the QR code right now to submit your question live. And we're going to try and rattle through as many as we can and get as many answers as you can. Before we do that, though, I did just want to ask one question to Debs for myself before we go into the viewers' ones as well. Because, look, it feels like we are at such a pivotal moment. We can see what's happening with the world, with Iran, Israel, the US, of course, getting involved in that conflict too. And today, the warnings about a potential attack on the UK. What's happened?
Yeah, so the government has released a new national security strategy today. And in that document, it says that the UK needs to actively prepare for the possibility of an attack on the home front. And it says that it's that's something that they've got to think about for the first time in many years. And reading that for me and for Rob, I imagine, given that it's exactly the kind of scenario that we wargamed for in the podcast, it was really chilling to see sort of reality echoes through everything that we've done in the podcast. It echoes through the lived experience now. And also in this strategy, the government's saying that they're going to start holding annual exercises for the whole of society to try to build up resilience, including around national infrastructure, but also just civil resilience and understanding of the need to be prepared for risks. So the fact the government's come out and decided to say this really underlines how they also believe that the threat is real and we need to prepare for it.
I mean, this is the thing. It really does put it all into perspective. And I have to say, the podcast has been fantastic. I'll definitely urge anyone to make sure that you listen to it as well. It's called Wargames, but really these are deadly serious. And Rob, they're the kind of thing that the government would be doing anyway, right?
That's absolutely right, yes. I mean, when I was briefly seconded from the University of Oxford to government, one of my jobs was actually to orchestrate war games that we could take a good look at how the UK would respond and what it would do. I think what was missing, though, in all those scenarios was really a sense of how does it feel for the public to be involved in these things? What's the public actually supposed to be doing in a crisis? And I think one of the things we've tried to do with the podcast is say, OK, look, here's what the government sort of does. Here's what a cabinet office looks like. Here's what a red cell, what the Russians will be thinking. But really, it's now down to the public. And I think I'm really hoping that the government, through this national security strategy, will start to lay out exactly how we're going to protect the British people.
Yeah, I mean, this is it. And I'll be honest, I'm one of these people. I mean, I talked to Debs about it before. I feel like I'm one of the kind of peacetime generation that is a bit naive about this. Like, I find it very hard to imagine an attack on the UK. But I guess through the podcast and stuff like this, it's a reality, or a possibility at least, that we're all having to grapple with in different ways. One comment from a reader coming in that I just wanted to embarrass you both with, this is from Adam, 1975. I thought the podcast was really well done. And Adam makes this point. He says it informed of how ill-prepared we are for such a scenario. God help us. Debs, I just want to ask you one question, just really following on from what Rob was saying there about citizens of the UK. So this is from a DV... 41D. So firstly, amazing podcast. What would happen if the UK surrendered to Russia? I take it Russia wouldn't want to occupy the UK. And how would a surrender affect the citizens of the UK in their daily lives? Debs, what do you reckon?
Well, it's kind of like nightmare scenario that for the UK, in terms of its actual, the way it thinks, it's part of an alliance. And obviously I'm here in The Hague, where you've got 32 members of the alliance who are trying collectively to bolster their defences so that they deter any kind of threat. And so they would never have to reach that point. But I mean, actually just drawing on what Mark Rutte, who's the head of NATO, said just the other week when he was visiting London, he told people you need to get serious about defence or start speaking Russian. He was obviously joking a bit there, and there's no suggestion that Russia wants to come and occupy the UK, but there is a serious concern about the potential for the Russian military when it regrows and rebuilds. It's obviously suffered a lot of it's used up a huge amount of resource in its war in Ukraine and caused, of course, devastating destruction there. But the country itself is on a war footing. It's a wartime economy. It's churning out weapons quickly. It has a huge military force. And there are real warnings that you hear from NATO allies about the potential for Vladimir Putin to test Article 5, which is that collective defence treaty, and to attack one member state to see how the other allies would respond. So it's not to say that there would be a case where we'd have to surrender, but there could well be a case where our ability to fight is put to the test.
You see, that's it. And how would the allies respond? Because you kind of feel insulated, if you like, by being an ally of the United States, but it's something that you explored in the podcast as well. Martin H. is saying in the series, the US not coming to the UK's aid is a big theme, but at one point the US Navy mobilises seemingly independent of the President's policy. So the question is, does the special relationship run deeper than the administration of the day? Rob, how would you answer that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in a sense, when we designed the game, what I wanted to do was to sort of try and test out just the UK's own defences. And the way to do that is to sort of just take some of the kind of more unpleasant remarks made in recent months by the US administration saying, look, if you don't pay for your own defence, we're not coming. Let's take that to a logical conclusion. And we said, OK, what does it look like when the UK tries to protect itself on its own? The fact is, this is a very, very low likelihood, high impact event that we were wargaming. It's much more likely the United States would come in with us. We are very closely integrated. There's lots of things the UK does the Americans need us to do. And it works the other way around too. We are also dependent on a lot of things the Americans give us. What I would say is the kind of the takeaway point about the American administration's injunction to the UK is they want us to spend more money on defence. They want us to be more capable in our defences. No one disagrees with that in the UK. I've not met any of my friends or public, figures who've said, oh yeah, we can get away with it now on the minimalist defence we've got. Everyone knows we need to do more, and it's strength that gives you peace. So it's not a question of Britain surrendering. I'd like to see the Russians try and make us do that. It's much more about how we've got to give ourselves the tools to actually allow ourselves to defend ourselves more robustly, less dependent. And actually the national security strategy, I'm delighted to say, actually points out that we do need to be more resilient and we need to be less dependent on a whole range of things, including just our American allies.
I think that's a really interesting point about strength bringing peace, because often you kind of think of like arming up being, I guess, preparing for war, when actually it could be that is the thing that is less likely to bring about war, actually. We're just continuing on the kind of US and whether or not the US would come to Britain's aid. I know you said that it was unlikely, and that's kind of picked up by Malcolm, and he's asked, were you able to factor into the game the substantial US presence at Lakenheath and at Mildenhall air bases? Even with the US showing extreme reluctance to support us, I'd find it hard to believe the US fighters would stay on the ground if Russia attacked their host nation. Debs, what do you think? What would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, we do talk about the American presence in the UK. I've got Chris Donnelly, who is the voice that you hear through the podcast. He's a former senior advisor here at NATO and someone who governments, military chiefs still speak to because he is seen as such a deep expert on Russia's ways of war. And he said to me that during the Cold War, Russia used to regard the UK as America's unsinkable aircraft carrier because of the sheer number of squadrons, American Air Force squadrons that were based in this country following the end of the Second World War. And while that number has reduced, that the person who wrote that question is correct. There is still significant American air power here in this country, but they answer to the commander-in-chief. And I think that's really important to underline as well. There's no suggestion that that would differ were the American commander-in-chief at the time to maybe not immediately mobilise to the UK's defences. Rob did say that this scenario is low likelihood but high impact, and it's important for the government to test that kind of scenario, because you need to be prepared, and if you're not prepared, then you will be caught short if the worst were to happen.
Yeah, I guess the whole point of wargaming, right, is that you have to prepare for all eventualities. I feel like one of the things that makes people feel perhaps naively sort of safe is the alliance that we've been talking about with the US, and the other thing, of course, is the nuclear deterrence. Libby's asked a really interesting question. She's asked, is one of the lessons of the series that the nuclear deterrent doesn't work when our enemies know we'd be so unlikely to use it when facing conventional attacks? Rob, how would you sort of tackle that question from Libby?
Yes, it's a good question. I can understand why it's arisen too, because, it's the ultimate weapon system, and nobody, if they're sane, wants to use it. I mean, it's not a first resort tool. But during the war game, Sir Ben Wallace says, when he's playing the part of the Prime Minister, look, deterrence works. We may be spending a lot of money on it, but it actually works. The reason why the conflict that we simulate becomes a limited conflict is precisely because we have a nuclear deterrent. Russia won't go the whole way. It knows it can't intimidate the UK into a position where it's literally just surrendering. So I think there's that sort of aspect to it. But by the same token, what we've got used to in the last few years is that Russia has increasingly used nuclear threats of rhetoric, if you like, of using nuclear weapons against the UK. It's totally irresponsible, and it's been proven to be unsuccessful. Threatening to use nukes is simply not buying it with the British or with the United States or with our NATO allies. And that's also worth remembering. It is our ultimate insurance policy. And the amazing thing is we've got young women and men under the sea today, right now, 24/7, ready to go, looking after the United Kingdom. So if there was any attempted nuclear attack, there would be an instant retaliation. And it's that threat of potential mutual destruction that stops people using nuclear weapons. Look what happened to Ukraine when it got rid of its nuclear arsenal. It was attacked by Russia conventionally. What we do need, though, and I think the war game brings out, is we need not just the nukes. We've got to have a strong conventional force. If you have that, you've got lots more options. If you give yourself a tiny, thin defence line, you're really saying, all I've got left is either diplomacy of collapse or I've got to use a nuclear weapon. Let's not put ourselves in that absurd situation. Let's make sure our defences are firm and robust.
That's so interesting about your point that you made there about Ukraine. Like, as soon as Ukraine gets rid of the nuclear weapons, then look what's happened. Debs, do you want to come in on nuclear weapons? Because it feels like it's such a big part of modern day defence, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, thank you. It's such an important subject, because I remember I've been a defence journalist for a long time now, and I can remember speaking to a former, well, he was serving at the time, military chief, who was saying to me that he absolutely supports the UK being a nuclear power. This was, around the time when there was a lot of debate. There was a debate in Parliament about the renewal of our nuclear deterrent, which is held by 4 nuclear-armed submarines. And right now there's a multi-billion-pound programme to renew the submarines, the warheads and the missiles. And he was saying that he absolutely believes that the UK needs to retain its status as one of only a very few number of confirmed nuclear-armed powers in the world. But he would question that status if being a nuclear power meant that the UK eroded its conventional forces to such a level that they no longer were credible. And I think that is such, for me, seeing the war game play out and then creating this podcast series, it's really opened my eyes to exactly that risk, that when you are a nuclear power, you also have a responsibility, not just with your nuclear deterrence, but also with your conventional deterrence. Because, like we see in the war game, when the UK is put under huge pressure with armed attack and it looks to its conventional forces and they are shrunken to the point that they cannot conduct high-intensity warfare for a sustained period of time. And they look to their allies. And yes, again, it's a low likelihood scenario that we wargame. The allies don't immediately come to the UK's aid with their conventional forces. Then the risk of rapid escalation into a nuclear exchange suddenly becomes extraordinarily real. And one other point that I think is really interesting and worth thinking about is how in the war game, the UK actually almost used the fact that it was in this situation of having very limited options when it came to responding in a way to end the Russian aggression in the game. It used that almost to kind of pressure its allies to get off the fence and come and help. And so I think it really shows the fundamental importance when it comes to talking about deterrence of conventional forces that help then build a proper escalatory ramp that can be gone up and down in a much more controlled way. And that's what used to be the case during the Cold War, when not just the UK, but all of its European allies had much larger conventional armed forces and reserves. And it just gave governments the options to have longer time to be able to deal with threats without immediately having to escalate to the nuclear button. And sorry, one final point as well. Our deterrent itself is, it is small compared to other nuclear powers. And that was a choice that we took to make it that way. And Rob is right, we have a submarine continuously at sea providing that deterrence. But because it is so small, if the actual deterrent itself gets threatened, then our ability even to sustain the nuclear deterrent without using it also comes into question. And I think that's a really important point to talk about.
This is why I love talking to you guys, because I feel like I'm learning stuff all the time. It's the question that, I didn't even think about the kind of size of the nuclear deterrent. I kind of almost think in my mind that everyone just has the same one. And then, you listen to the podcast and the different scenarios and do, interviews with you guys as well. And it's just very, very, it's really interesting, I have to say, for people who are not in this sphere 24/7. Right, let's talk about some more questions, shall we? So I love this one because it's from someone who said that they are an expat listening from afar in Australia. So really showing that this is a global audience that can tune into this, and lots of different people, of course, from different countries or living in different countries will have different perspective on it as well. So this is from the Banoffee Project. They've said, did you think about recording two different conclusions? I feel it would be beneficial to hear the two most likely scenarios played out. Maybe a little idea there for next time there, Rob. What do you reckon?
Well, it's great to hear, actually, because we had a bit of a debate about how it should end. And the decision we made was that there was no ending, because it's the public who are going to write the ending for us. It's our own citizenry who are going to say, look, I'm concerned about this, I don't feel safe, and I want something done. The amazing thing is that every time we ran a rehearsal for these sort of war games, I asked the question to all the participants, whoever they were students or whatever. I asked them the question, do you feel safe now you've been through this experience? And they all said that they did not, and they wanted to get interested in what's going on in this realm. In terms of endings, we probably will do another sort of war game like this. I'm very interested in the fact we might do a televised version. But what we did with this particular one, which is kind of strange, people think I was crazy doing this kind of war game, but it's none of the participants knew what the outcome was going to be. None of them knew what was coming at them. They literally knew they were in a sort of Cobra environment, and they were subjected to a series of critical dilemmas that they had to solve. I have to say they did pretty well, considering that, you put through people the Ministry of Defence through this thing, and they also find it tough. But actually, we've got to run this again, I think, because people are interested. What do I do? How would I protect myself?
How do I put in my application to be PM in the new one? I'm not sure I've got the background.
You might have to get elected.
Yeah, might have to get elected first, and then you'll consider it. I love it, because to be fair, it is incredible the calibre of people that you've had with the experience that they've brought to the table as well. Debs, I've got a question here from Kenneth, who says, could the UK use its strengths like special forces, GCHQ, to retaliate with raids or cyber attacks. In episodes that I've heard, the response was mainly limited to Navy aerial battles, but could we put Russia off in other ways? I mean, this is a really important question, isn't it? And it does feel like it gets to the heart of the new kind of warfare that we're experiencing, Debs.
Yeah, very much so. It's a really good question. And actually, in the war game, we repeat in every episode that nothing that we discuss in the game is classified. And of course, every country has its secrets. And so the scenarios and the options that are discussed in the Cobra meeting are ones that don't reveal any of our secrets. But yes, the questioner is correct. There are other means, and our players do allude to special forces and cyber activity and space activity that could be used, but we don't go into details. I mean, I don't know the details, but there are other options that can be used, and there are other different forms of warfare. We had to, because this whole series was it was created for a podcast, which is quite difficult to translate that into an audio form and to bring listeners in and to hold their hand and bring them into a world that we're creating. I was conscious of not wanting, and Rob and I were conscious of not wanting to throw too many different types of weapons and attacks at people, because it would become a bit confusing. But yeah, of course, there are so many different methods of attack in sort of like, it's called like sub-threshold, underneath the threshold of conventional armed conflict. Anything can be a weapon, as we've seen with the use of, sort of tweets, posts on social media, hacking and leaking of emails, using sabotage against energy infrastructure, political assassinations. There is a whole range of tools that hostile actors can use against another country, and we were just playing out a few of those scenarios.
Yeah, it's a really important point about not giving away any sort of state secrets, because obviously we don't want to put the country more at risk if anyone else is watching, not just people from Australia, obviously. Right, Rob, I've got a question from Charlie, who's asked, the UK has quite a large defence sector and is capable of building ships, planes, tanks, etc. Could this not be scaled up quickly in the event of an all-out war, seeing as we're the second largest defence exporter globally after the US? What do you make of Charlie's point?
That's a great question from Charlie. So thank you much indeed for raising it. You're absolutely right that, it does look like, doesn't it, that the UK is capable of all sorts of defence capabilities. I think the problem is, let me put it like this, the last time the UK actually built a main battle tank was 20 years ago, 2004. Yes, it's got a shipbuilding program. That's great, but we're building them actually quite slowly. If you look at the way the South Koreans build warships, for example, they're much, much quicker than us at doing it. And again, it comes down to money. It's like, what cash are you prepared to put into this? We've got a small air force. It's still the few, isn't it? The famous old line in 1940 about the few. It still is. And frankly, we could do with a lot more aviators in all this as well, and not just, Royal Air Force, but also the aviators we find, operating from Royal Navy carriers. The fact is we've underinvested for a long period of time in the defence infrastructure and defence industrial base. The defence industrial base we have today is very, very small indeed. We could really, really do with a much bigger scheme. I'd like to see, for example, automated manufacturing. We have additive manufacturing tools now, modern ways of manufacturing that doesn't require the old industrial infrastructure in that way. But we could do with that. It would be amazing to see, more people going through technical education, getting apprenticeships, being part of that. I know the government wants to do it, but at the moment the scale is very, very small indeed. And I think really we've got to go quicker, which I think the government recognise, but it does come down to the money. And I think the thing that worries us all the most about the UK is that it knows what direction to go in, but it's just saying, oh, well, we're not going to spend the serious money for 10 more years. That's what the National Security Strategy appears to be saying. I don't know whether the Treasury and the Prime Minister have listened to our podcast, but I'm hoping that if they do, it'll change their minds.
Yeah, I'll have to check in with them. Next time I get a minister on, I'm going to try and find out. It's interesting because I come at this from quite a political perspective with the role that I do at Sky News. And it does really seem to me like they're just grappling with so many different things. And, you see it with the winter fuel allowance, you see it on the disability. Every time they try and make savings elsewhere, they get a rebellion and have to reverse it. And they are almost in this kind of impossible situation where the need for defence spending is so clear, and you lay it out in the podcast so clearly. But then they're up against the kind of reality in the UK of Parliament being full of people who, have got very used to that peace dividend. Debs, how do you think they should navigate it?
Yeah, I mean, it's all about sort of learning and refamiliarising ourselves with the kind of situation that we had during the Cold War. So those in charge during that time had either lived through the Second World War or their parents had, and so they understood inherently the need for the kind of structures to make your society resilient, but also to make your military able to not just fight immediately that a threat emerges. In that case, it would have been from the Soviet Union, but also to sustain a fight. So to have reserves that were ready, mobilised, trained to come in behind, and then, as Rob was talking about, an industrial base that can sustain the amount of ammunition and weapons that are needed to be able to fight. And I remember when I was looking into being prepared for war, because we obviously hear people talking about we're a pre-war generation. That was what the previous government used to say. The last time the UK was a pre-war generation in the 1930s, the government started this programme of shadow factories where it used, for example, car manufacturers started to convert themselves to make Spitfire aircraft. And they set up, when I was looking into this, I went to some huge cattle farm that was converted to make parts for aircraft. And of course, our industrial base now is so different and technology has rapidly changed. But if there really is this urgent need that we're being told that there is, and from everything that I've reported on, I absolutely believe it to be the case, then there does need to be urgent change now. And the government's strategic defence review that they published at the beginning of this month talks about how they're going to be building more ammunition factories, buying more missiles, but until the contracts are actually signed, then the words are very hollow, and it's dangerous to have hollow words at a time like this.
I mean, that, I guess, brings us on to a question from Hazel C., who's written in to say most people in the UK seem to be unaware of the likelihood of war between the UK and Russia. How can we get productions like the Wargame further up in people's consciousness so they consider all the scenarios and we urgently begin to get more prepared? Rob, what would you say to that?
Oh, what a brilliant question. That's why we did it. She's absolutely on the money. Well, I've mentioned already, the idea we might do a TV version, hopefully one day. But, my next book, I hope, is going to be on this idea of national defence. How does a nation defend itself? We were very lucky that when we were making this work together, this war game, we had Lucy Easthope with us. And she's an amazing lady. She just has such a humane approach to how do we all look after ourselves and each other? How do we look after our neighbours? What should you do prior to a crisis? How about stockpiling a few sort of tinned and packet foods? If there's an emergency, you don't think the water might go off, then fill your bath and cover it with cling film. I mean, really lovely sort of practical things you can do. But in terms of raising public awareness, I think what I'd love to see is an episode of Coronation Street or EastEnders, where we have people around a table in the pub having a chat about what they can do, how they can volunteer. One of the things that's gone wrong, I think, is that we tend to think of whenever we have problems that the government's going to come along and sort it all out. I wonder whether we need to get back to that great British tradition of saying, what can we do? I want to step forward. Look at the way that the public amazingly responded to COVID. 500,000 volunteers came forward when the appeal went out for assistance. And those volunteers were amazing. And so I think we've got a society that really, really wants to help, wants to do something. And if we can do things like this podcast and maybe a TV version, some other things, we could raise that awareness and we could really mobilise people such that politicians can no longer ignore us. They're going to have to help. They're going to have to do things.
And Debs, I just want to just kind of squeeze in one final question of my own, because the first time we did one of these Q&As, the podcast hadn't dropped yet, so it felt that we had to be quite aware of spoilers. And I'm aware that some people listening might not have listened to the full podcast as well. But is there a particular moment that you would like to kind of pick out over the series that really stood out to you for whatever reason?
Oh wow!
I put you on the spot. Sorry.
There are so many. You have put me on the spot. There were lots of different moments in the series that made me that just gave me goosebumps when I was going through it, because obviously I poured my heart into this because it's something that I feel so passionately about, having in my work been in war zones and also reported on the erosion of the UK's defences, our armed forces, and our sort of like our collective national memory of what it's like to be a country that is not just prepared for war, but would be able to deter threats and then respond in a crisis effectively. And I think for me, it was Chris Donnelly, who is this person I spoke about earlier, who I went to go and visit. He's long retired now, but people still speak to him. And it was the way that his words and his experience from time in the Cold War echo out throughout the reality of the war game that we played, and then all that we're seeing now. I mean, I'm here sitting in a NATO summit where allies are agreeing to a new spending target, but still playing the same old games of smoke, mirror, fudging numbers, rather than genuinely getting serious. And I think for me, it's like that urgency that really comes out through the podcast of the need to it's not about panicking or scaremongering. It's about just a cold, hard appreciation of the reality, what needs to be done, remembering how we did this before, and then just getting on with it. And I think just one final point in terms of a real moment for me was Rob and his grandfather's pocket watch, and the ticking of the pocket watch ticking down, telling us that our time is running out.
I love that. Such a lovely kind of moment to end on. Your aim was obviously to try and raise public consciousness and political consciousness, actually, of something that couldn't be more important, the defence of our nation, and you've really done that. So I just wanted to say kind of congratulations to both of you on such a brilliant podcast. I've absolutely loved it. And thanks as well to viewers and listeners for sending in your questions as well. It's pretty clear from the calibre of the questions how engaged people have been in the podcast as well. So that is all from us. I'm going to let you get back to NATO. Rob's in some kind of mysterious, undisclosed location, which sounds, very exciting given what we're talking about. But who knows? Thanks both very much for giving us your time. And just to finish with a reminder that you can listen to the full Wargame series wherever you enjoy your podcasts.